Welcome, everybody. We'll get started in just a minute, and thank you for joining us today. The presenter is Larry Lowenthal, who some of you may recognize from a number of Zoom programs earlier, 20s, 21, 22, and so forth. And Larry's given a number of really excellent and interesting programs, but today we have him in person. So that's exciting, and we welcome him here in person at the Wellesley COA. And as you all know, the topic is the partition of India in 1947. And would just like to remind everyone to silence your cell phones. And just to give you a little bit of information about Larry, he is a longtime educator. He taught literature at various universities and colleges in the U.S. He also was in Israel for a while, teaching there, and then came back to the States and was the executive director of a number of Jewish organizations in the Boston area. So a lifetime of learning for Larry, and he shares that with us today. So thank you, Larry.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Thank you for coming. Before anything else, I want to make it very, very clear to everybody that this is a very disturbing topic. As we used to say in academia, I'm issuing a trigger warning, and I'm very serious. Anybody who feels that they may be affected negatively by some of the content of this issue that we're discussing today, please feel free to excuse yourself. It's a disturbing topic, but a profoundly important topic. We've distributed 2 maps. Thank you so much for the office for copying them. Let me just take a few minutes to go over the map so that we get a sense of our geography and our history. India, needless to say, and I'm sure some of you have been to India, is extraordinarily massive and complex. It would take a lifetime to really immerse oneself in all of its complexities. What I'm trying to do today is simply give a fundamental overview of a very, very complicated issue, the partition of India in 1947. What has always fascinated me about this issue is its proximity to the partition of Palestine, an issue that was very, very close to my heart and interest. I lived in Israel for 5 years. I taught at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and 5 years at Tel Aviv University. My field was English and American literature. What you see here in the map before independence, and I've circled some of the areas that I think of are importance. The shaded areas are those parts of India that were ruled by princes, maharajas, rajas, people of extraordinary regional power. The non-shaded areas were those areas controlled by the British colonial rule and empire. Going to the very north, I circled Kashmir, which is still, as we know, just from reading your daily newspaper or watching television, is an area of extraordinary, one might even say, seemingly irreconcilable conflict. It was under a princely regime, but with partition, that prince, even though he had a massive numerical proportion of the people who were Muslim, chose to remain in India. That's the source of this real problem. Lahore, going straight down south from Kashmir, Lahore, really the capital of Punjab, was a scene of horrific violence. Punjab state is the area, along with Bengal, go to the very right of the map. Bengal and Punjab were the 2 key areas that suffered the most of the violent upheaval with partition. New Delhi, the current capital of India. Straight down south from New Delhi, you see Agra. Agra is the site of the Taj Mahal. Going easterly, you see Benares, which is, I circled it simply because it's of extreme religious importance, a holy city that attracts massive religious pilgrimage. Bengal to the east, with Calcutta directly south of the tidal Bengal. Again, along with Punjab, the area of the most violent upheaval. Going to the very west coast, you see one of the major cities, of course, Bombay. Calcutta, just in the Bengali region, we'll talk about because it was the city that was effectually saved from massive human destruction by Gandhi at the height of the upheaval. The partition, take a look at the map after independence and partition. It looks really weird. I'm sure you're baffled by the map, because what we have is a division of India into India proper, Hindu India, West Pakistan, which became, of course, Muslim, and East Pakistan, separated by 1,000 miles of Hindu India. Just looking at this map and trying to struggle with the rationale of the partition line that was drawn almost desperately under great, great pressure and time constriction by a British lawyer, led to this bifurcation, which inevitably, inexorably led to the kind of massive upheaval that we're going to talk about. Kashmir, notice, is located within India, even though its population is essentially Muslim. East Pakistan is now Bangladesh. There was a terrible civil war between West Pakistan and East Pakistan in the late 60s and culminating in the defection of East Pakistan from West Pakistan, and now we know it as Bangladesh. It was a brutal civil war. It's confusing. We can't go into all the details. It would take many, many lectures to do so. Let me just say that even though West Pakistan and East Pakistan were Muslim, they were entirely different people. West Pakistan essentially were Punjabis. East Pakistan were essentially Bengali. So they had the same religion, totally different language, ethnicity, background, and so forth. Okay? Let me go through this as best I can. Those of you who want to plunge as deeply as you can with the time you have at your hands, I strongly recommend a book that was a very big bestseller a number of years ago on this issue. It's called Freedom at Midnight by Larry Collins and Dominique Lapierre. It's about 650 pages. It's well worth reading. These are two wonderful writers with whom you may be familiar. Okay. The partition of India, 1947. On the stroke of midnight, August 14th, 1947, Great Britain's 300-year colonial rule over India, the jewel in the British crown, came to an end. Within a very dangerously constricted space of time, the massive Indian subcontinent of 400 million people, essentially Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, about 6 million located in the north, were partitioned into two independent states, nation states, Hindu India, Muslim Pakistan. Immediately, and really unexpectedly, there began the largest human migration in history. Millions of Muslims fled desperately out of Hindu areas into Muslim areas in Pakistan. East Pakistan, again known today as Bangladesh. Well, millions of Hindus and Sikhs fled desperately from Muslim-controlled areas into Hindu India. The exodus ultimately numbered 20 million people. An estimated 1 to 2 million people never made it. When you study the figures of losses during the partition plan, the partition era, it's very difficult to come to any kind of clear consensus. The rock bottom figure is 200,000, issued by Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy of India. This is absurd. Mountbatten, who was a splendid figure in so many ways, tried desperately to downplay the carnage for the sake of Britain's reputation. I've read statistics based on census reports over a number of years that include missing people between 2.3 million and 3.2 million. Missing people. We're talking about one of the greatest and most horrendous violent eruptions in Western history or Eastern history. What's important for us all to understand is that this partition really marked the beginning of the end of the British Empire, the largest empire in recorded history. And in terms of almost unspeakable human carnage, the atrocities that exploded as a result of partition may be second only to the European Holocaust from 1933 to 1945. Across the Indian subcontinent, communities that had coexisted for thousands of years attacked each other in a terrifying outburst of sectarian violence, with Hindus and Sikhs on one side and Muslims on the other, a mutual genocide as unexpected as it was unprecedented. In Punjab and Bengal, which I've tried to point out on the map, which abutted India's borders with West and East Pakistan, the carnage was especially intense, with massacres, arson, forced conversions, mass abduction, and savage sexual violence. Some 100,000 women were raped. Many of them were disfigured and dismembered. Gangs of killers set whole villages on fire, hacking to death women, children, aged people, and dragging off young women to be raped. Some British soldiers and journalists who had witnessed the Nazi atrocities during the Holocaust said that the partition's atrocities were worse. Pregnant women had their breasts cut off, babies were ripped out of their bellies, infants were found roasted on spits. It was that grotesque. The partition was a cataclysm without precedent, unforeseen in magnitude, unordered in pattern, unreasoned in savagery. For 6 terrible weeks, like a mysterious ravage plague, a mania for murder and rapine spread across the entire face of India. There would be no sanctuary from its scourge. 6 times as many Indians were slaughtered as were all American soldiers in combat during the 4 years of World War II. It was not a civil war. It was not a guerrilla campaign. It was a convulsion, the sudden shattering collapse of an entire society. If you look at the map, you can see the obvious danger points. This sounds incredible, but when Britain decided to leave India and partition its geography, they brought in an esteemed attorney from Great Britain named Sir Cyril Radcliffe. And his credentials were that he had never stepped foot in India, knew very little about India. He was given blueprints and demographic maps and told within a few days to literally subdivide a continent of 400 million people. He did the best he could, but it was, for the most part, a desperate and almost futile gesture, leaving 5 million Sikhs and Hindus in Pakistan's half of the partition and over 5 million Muslims in India's half. Part of it was simple greed. Partition meant to the Muslims, well, now we have Muslim control. That means all Hindu stores and factories and farms belong to us. And the Hindus said the same. Oh, now that we're under Hindu control, Muslim farms, factories, stores, businesses belong to us. Carnage breaks out. So as much material gain, one might say, as religious hatred. It's almost impossible to plummet to the depths of this kind of upheaval. Europe had slaughtered one another with modern techniques, industrial machinery and technology, howitzers and bombs and the gas chambers of the Holocaust. The people of Punjab and Bengal set out to destroy themselves with bamboo staves, with hockey sticks, ice picks, knives, clubs, swords, hammers, bricks, and clawing fingernails. It was a spontaneous, irrational, unpredictable slaughter. Appalled at the emotions they had inadvertently created, Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh leaders tried to calm their people down, but it was a hopeless cry. India simply went mad, and there was no controlling it. The one exception, and it was a miraculous exception, took place in Calcutta. Calcutta at that time was about 4.5 million people. Today, Greater Calcutta is about 15 million people. The year before, August of 1946, Calcutta had erupted into sectarian rage when a large Muslim gathering got together in the city, screaming and crying for a Muslim nation state under the leadership of their leader, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Within 3 days, 10,000 people were killed and 15,000 people were wounded. Now, Mahatma Gandhi, the great political, spiritual leader of India's long struggle against British colonialism, was horrified at the slaughter of his beloved fellow country people. And he made a decision. He went with an entourage to the slums of Calcutta. He embedded himself in a slum apartment along with 300,000 other slum dwellers in Calcutta. And he clearly announced that he would starve himself to death until Muslim, Hindu, and Sikh leaders could come to a peaceful commitment for peace. Gandhi was very frail to begin with, as we know. He was only about 5 feet tall, weighed about 114 pounds. And he went into a fast that lasted for 22 days, came very, very close to death, until finally all three leaders of the three communities signed a pledge of peace. The pledge miraculously lasted, and Gandhi's incredible spiritual and political strength prevailed in Calcutta and probably saved not thousands of lives, but probably tens of thousands of lives. Tragically, only weeks after celebrating this incredible spiritual victory, this moral triumph, Gandhi was assassinated by a Hindu nationalist who literally despised Gandhi's commitment to brotherhood, peace, and ahimsa, the Hindu concept of nonviolence. The comparison of the partition horror to the Nazi death camps is not as far-fetched as it may seem. And here's why. Let me suggest this. Partition is central to the modern identity in the Indian subcontinent, as the Holocaust is utterly central in many respects to identity amongst Jews, branded painfully and inexorably on their regional conscience by memories of almost unparalleled violence. Let me quote an acclaimed Pakistani historian, Ayesha Jalal, who called partition the central historical event in 20th century South Asia. A defining moment that is neither beginning nor end. Partition continues to influence how the people and states of post-colonial South Asia envisioned their past, their present, and their future. How do we locate the origin of this incredible historical phenomenon, the British partition of India? Well, Britain's conquest of India begins with a powerful trade enterprise called the East India Trading Company, which received exclusive trading rights in Asia from Queen Elizabeth I in 1599. They flourished with trade, but trade within 2 centuries led to military conquest. In 1757, Robert Clive had an army of 900 British soldiers and 2,000 Indian sepoy infantrymen, and they routed an army led by a troublesome Bengali leader, marking the true start of the British conquest of India. 1858, Queen Victoria is named Empress of India, establishing once and for all England's domination of 1/5 of the world's population. How did Britain control all this? How did they maintain control over such a vast territory and over 400 million incredibly diverse people? Well, with 2,000 members of the Indian Civil Service, 10,000 British officers of the Indian Army, their authority was sustained by 60,000 British regular soldiers and 200,000 native Indian soldiers, all united, ready and able to suppress any uprising that challenged British authority over India. I'm going to try to describe the vast, overwhelming entity called India as perceived in 1947. And again, I refer you to this extraordinary book, Freedom at Midnight, by Collins and LaPierre. Let me quote them. Theirs was a land of supreme spiritual attainment and the most debasing misery on earth. A land where people were more fertile than its fields. A land obsessed by God and beset by natural and calamities unsurpassed in cruelty and dimension. A land of past accomplishment and present concern, whose future was compromised by problems more taxing than those confronting any other assembly of human beings on earth. Yet for all that, for all her ills, India, in their own words, was one of the supreme and enduring symbols protruding above the cultural horizon of mankind. Beautiful. A nation of 275 million Hindus, 70 million of them, or population of France, were untouchables. Dalits, meaning the oppressed ones, or Gandhi's appellation of the untouchables, the Harijan, the children of God. 50 million Muslims, 7 million Christians, 6 million Sikhs, 100,000 Parsis, and 24,000 Jews whose forebears had fled after the destruction of the temple during the Babylonian exile. The only common tongue was English, the language of the colonial power ruling them, and that rule was coming to an end. India was a nation at that time with 15 official languages and 850 dialects in current daily use. India would harbor a leper population the size of Switzerland, enough beggars to populate all of Holland. 15 million Sudhus, or holy men. 38,000 Indians were born every single day. Half of them died before they were 5 years of age. 10 million other Indians died each year from malnutrition, undernourishment, and diseases like smallpox, which had been eradicated in most other nations of the world. The great subcontinent of India was probably the most spiritual place on earth. Birthplace of a great religion, Buddhism, the motherland of Hinduism, deeply influenced by Islam, a land where gods came in a bewildering array of forms and figures, with religious practices ranging from the many, many different versions of yoga to the most intense meditation that the human spirit is capable of experiencing. The pantheon, those of you who know something about Hinduism, the pantheon of India's gods contain 3 million deities, a god for every imaginable human need. Here's my take on Hinduism. Is it really a polytheistic religion? I'm not sure, since Brahma is the ultimate reality. Brahma is the ultimate divine existence, and all the millions of gods are mere manifestations of the one true God. India would embrace one of the richest men in the world and 300 million peasants living at the very border of existence. People were dispersed over what might have been one of the Earth's richest surfaces and yet remain one of the poorest. 90% of India's population was illiterate. Her per capita income at that time was 5 cents a day. And a quarter of the people in her 2 greatest cities ate, slept, defecated, fornicated, and died in the open streets. Her economy was essentially feudal, benefiting a handful of wealthy capitalists. And her imperial rulers, the British, made very little efforts to industrialize this massive land. Her exports were essentially commodities like jute and tea and tobacco and cotton. Almost all the machinery had to be imported. India's percentage of electricity was ridiculously low, only 200th that of the United States. Her soil contained at least a quarter of the world's reserves of iron ore, and yet her steel production was one of the lowest on earth. She had 6,000 kilometers of coastline, but a fishing industry so primitive that they could not even guarantee a per capita fish for the population. But despite horrendous deficiencies, India, on August 15th, 1947, emerged as a free, autonomous, sovereign nation, proud of its Gandhian nonviolent resistance to British rule and committed to a future of open, dedicated, and committed democracy. As you know, I'm sure, India today is the largest functioning political democracy in the world, despite the growing authoritarianism of Narendra Modi, the current ruler. Let's go back to the words of Jawaharlal Nehru, first Prime Minister, at the very moment of freedom on August 15th. Now, Nehru, like Gandhi and most of the other Indian leaders, had spent 9 years in British prisons for resistance to British rule. But his speech on that day is really worth repeating. He had very little time to draft a prepared speech. I was hardly aware of what I was saying, he would later tell his sister. The words came welling up, but my mind could only think about the horrors in Punjab and Bengal. Here's some of the speech. A moment comes, Nehru's speech began, when we step out from the old to the new, when an age ends, and when the soul of a nation, long suppressed, finds utterance. At the dawn of history, India started on her unending quest, and the trackless centuries are filled with her striving and the grandeur of her successes and failures. Through good and ill fortune alike, she has never lost sight of that quest or forgotten the ideals which gave her strength. We end today a period of ill fortune, and India discovers herself again. This is no time for petty and destructive criticism, he concluded. No time for ill will or blaming others. We have to build the noble mansion of free India where all her children may dwell. Now, today, those of you who have followed this issue know that there is still tremendous debate raging over partition. I'm not here to resolve this. I'm here to simply bring the issue to your attention. The debate revolves about the speed in which it was affected and the unimaginable horrors that erupted in its wake. Frankly, my own sense is that a careful review of the circumstances at that time and considering the primary actors involved can only lead one to believe that no other option was really available. India was looming towards civil war as Britain desperately tried to back out. I don't think that there was much that Britain could have done to prevent it. Let's go back to the beginning, see if we can find our bearings. Great Britain emerged victorious after World War II. but at a very, very heavy price. Exhaustion of resources, a crippled industrial base, near financial bankruptcy, unrelenting labor problems, 2 million people unemployed, food, fuel, rationing, and massive public impatience with trying to sustain the empire that was rebelling apparently all over the world. The imperial era was coming to an end. Now, Winston Churchill, certainly one of the greatest wartime leaders in history, was voted out of power in 1945 by the British electorate. The Tories were voted out. Labour Party under Prime Minister Clement Attlee was voted in. All kinds of reasons. Can't go into it now. Attlee and the Labour Party was committed to dismantling the British Empire. Enough is enough. Our time has come to an end. Beginning with India, and shortly after to the withdrawal of the British Mandate Authority in Palestine, literally 3.5 months after partition, Britain threw the entire problem of the Arab-Jewish conflict into the hands of the General Assembly of the United Nations. The vote was taken on November 29, 1947, dividing Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, a decision which irrevocably changed the entire history of the Middle East. And here's what's interesting in my mind. Both reasons for partition were the same. The realization that religious and ethnic communities like Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Jews, and Arabs simply couldn't get along, simply couldn't live together. A tragic impasse that demanded territorial partition into sectarian states. Now, Attlee put the entire problem of British departure from India into the hands of one of the most admired men in all of Britain, and that is Lord Louis Mountbatten, close relative of the royal family, former Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Southeast Asia during World War II, a brilliant, incredibly charismatic, incredibly charming and persuasive figure, an aristocrat with a dazzling common touch. Mountbatten's assignment: arrange British departure from India with ritualistic dignity, with grace, without bloodshed, and do it all in a matter of weeks, not months. Mountbatten hardly wanted the assignment, but he reluctantly took it out of duty and took on the position of the last viceroy of India, probably the most powerful political position on earth. A ruler with absolute authority over 400 million people. What was his strategy? Mountbatten's strategy was to meet one-on-one with the key leaders of India's independence movement. Mohandas Gandhi, the key leader, revered as a saint by all the communities, the Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh communities. Nehru, the leader of the Hindu Congress Party. Vallabhbhai Patel, a brilliant Hindu political strategist and Nehru's chief rival. And Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the undisputed leader of India's huge Muslim population and the head of the All India Muslim League Party. So, Mountbatten meets first with Gandhi, charms the hell out of him. They loved each other. He meets with Nehru. They love each other. Their wives loved each other as well. Meets with Patel. Patel was vastly different from Nehru. Nehru was a strict socialist. Patel was a strict capitalist. But they were key leaders in the independence movement, gets them all to agree and make a commitment to Indian unity after partition. All agreed that partition would lead to nothing but chaos and violence and death. Everything looked good until Mountbatten met with Jinnah. Now, Jinnah is one of the most weird figures, one of the really strange figures of modern momentous history. A man who rarely stepped foot into a mosque, who ate pork, who drank wine, who dressed in elegant clothes, and yet was a dedicated Muslim nationalist. He refused to go along with unity, demanded a separate Muslim state, which he would call Pakistan, on the grounds that he could not trust the Hindu majority to guarantee the safety of his fellow Muslim people. Despite all of Mountbatten's charm, persuasiveness, Jinnah was adamant, unyielding, utterly rigid, and the rest is history. Jinnah's dream of an independent, sovereign Muslim state was realized, despite the absurdity on your map of 1,000 miles separating the two parts of Pakistan. As I tried to explain before, after a very vicious civil war in 1971, East Pakistan bolts out of Pakistan and becomes Bangladesh. How to draw some kind of conclusion for our purpose today on this huge and complicated issue? I go back to Collins and LaPierre, who chose to end their 650 pages of analysis and historical overview with the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi, one of the greatest human beings, clearly, who ever lived. Joseph Stalin once cynically stated, "The death of a single person is a tragedy. The death of 1 million people is a statistic." How true this is in the case of Gandhi. Gandhi was dubbed Mahatma, or the Great Soul, by his dear friend, Rabindranath Tagore, Bengali Nobel Prize-winning writer and poet. Gandhi was shot to death by Nathuram Godse, who was a leader in the RSSS, an extreme Hindu nationalist party. They blamed Gandhi's pacifism and his outreach and compassion for Muslim victims of partition as a key factor in Hindu suffering. Godse killed Gandhi as Gandhi came out of a prayer meeting at 5:17 p.m. on January 30th, 1948. Gandhi's last words after being shot 3 times in the chest was, "Hey Ram, hey Ram." Oh God. Gandhi's death stunned not only India, but the entire world. Mountbatten, as he looked down at the body lying in state, was heard to say that Mahatma Gandhi will go down in history on a par with Buddha and Jesus Christ. His murder, George Bernard Shaw said, shows how dangerous it is to be good. The Hindustani Standard newspaper left an entire editorial page blank with a black band with the following paragraph set in boldface type. Gandhi has been killed by his own people, for whose redemption he lived. This second crucifixion in the history of the world has been enacted on a Friday, the same day Jesus was done to death 1,915 years ago. Father, forgive us. 3 million people gathered at his funeral. Ministers and coolies, maharajas, untouchables, sweepers, governors, veiled Muslim women, representatives from every race, creed, color, class, caste in India, all united by their common burden of grief, an unstructured, massive flow of humanity. Margaret Bourke White, the legendary photographer, recorded the entire scene with her Leica lens. She realized with mind-boggling awe that she was recording, in her own words, the largest crowd ever to gather on the face of the earth. Nehru, Gandhi's dear friend and disciple, brokenhearted and in tears, addressed the entire nation on All India Radio. And here is his speech. The light has gone out of our lives, and there is darkness everywhere. Our beloved leader, Bapu, the father of our nation, is no more. The light has gone out, as I have said, and yet I was wrong. For the lights that shone in this country was no ordinary light. In 1,000 years, that light will still be seen. The world will see it, and it will give solace to innumerable hearts. For that light represented something more than the immediate present. It represented the living, the eternal truths, reminding us of the right path, drawing us from error, taking this ancient country to freedom. Mahatma Gandhi achieved in death what he had striven to achieve in the last months of his life. His murder eased the savage, insane killing of neighbor by neighbor in India's villages and cities. The antagonisms obviously didn't go away. All you have to do is read your local paper, your New York Times or Washington Post, or watch the news to see that the antagonisms are continuing even now. But for the most part, the battle is waged by nation states between regular armies on the battlefield. Gandhi's sacrifice would stand as the climatic act of the triumph and tragedy which savagely gripped the Indian subcontinent in the fateful years of 1947 and 48. Thank you. Comments, questions, thoughts, memories? Yes, sir.
You mentioned how Gandhi saved so many people from Calcutta. Was that the year before? What was his role after the independence? I mean, why wasn't he doing the same kind of thing, fasting, during that time when 2 million or 3 or 4 or 5 million people were dead?
Well, this was during that time. Calcutta was really ready to explode in a far greater dimension than 1946. It's hard to imagine a cataclysm. It's hard to imagine a convulsion of this immensity. What did he have? What did Gandhi have except his frail 114-pound, less than 5-foot body? All he could do was threaten to starve himself to death. He could only do that so many times. He did it a number of times, came close to death. He was very frail. He was 77 years old, I believe. that's my response is what he did was as a small feat of miraculous salvation in the midst of a cataclysm that dwarfs the human imagination. And I can't help but believe he saved, again, not thousands of lives, but tens of thousands of lives. Just compare what happened in Calcutta to what happened in Lahore, in the Punjab. Yes, sir.
What was India like before colonial?
Well, it was made up of these princely states, and they ruled with absolute divine kingship authority. And they were super rich, whereas their people were miserably poor. Now, interesting. Notice there has never been a massive social revolution in Hinduism, right? Why? Well, you got to study Hinduism. Hinduism looks at what we call reality and sees Maya, sees illusion. The Hindu looks beyond immediate reality to a world of perfection that can only be attained through incredible ritualistic spiritual devotion. I'm Jewish. Jews have been at the forefront of every revolution over the last 200 years because that's not the Judaic perspective on the physical and metaphysical world. Judaism is radically different. Judaism is focused on this world that has to be brought to a higher state of perfection in partnership, in alliance with the God who created the whole thing. Hinduism is vastly different. So you have hundreds of millions of Indians living with disease and starvation and utter penury, but spiritually looking beyond their suffering to something that will be blissfully permanent. That's my take off the top of my head, really. And again, I'm not an expert on India. It would require years of devotion and study to get to the heart of this incredible, complex nation state. But I'm very interested in world religions, particularly Hinduism. Very interesting. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk to the rail system. One of the few things the British Empire tried to establish was a good communication. And some sort of accident.
When you read current political and sociological and economic analyses of India and China, what do you find out? What is holding India back from really competing on a par with China? The deteriorating infrastructure, which is what you just mentioned. India has to devote far more national resources to improving the infrastructure. China has done remarkably well in that regard. And China may very well be the #1 economic power in the world, outdistancing even us. But infrastructure is crucial. So what you're reading is reflective of the problem that India is currently facing. Now, India, again, has brought hundreds of millions of Indians up from poverty into the middle class, and that's why Modi continues to be elected. Although there's more and more resistance to his growing authoritarianism. But we have to, and same with the British. Maybe I gave too negative a picture of the British colonial rule. But yes, they built the railroads, they built the infrastructure, they created a civil service class that brought a lot of Indians into sophisticated public service. India was very loyal to Britain during World War I and very loyal to Britain during World War II. Very loyal. And after the war ended, they said, we've served you faithfully, and now you've got to acknowledge our demand for freedom. And that's when the trouble began. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. I'm having a little trouble hearing. hearing.
China more centrally organized? Are the people in China
Ah,
more willing to support
ah.
themselves to a government plan?
Interesting point. China is very powerfully centrally controlled. The Communist Party is still in existence, despite the capitalistic advances that China has made. You can't say the same for India. India does not have that political tradition. De Gaulle made a famous comment about ruling France. How can you rule a people that create 650 different kinds of cheese? Well, how could you rule a country that has 15 different languages, official languages, and 850 dialects? So thank you for that point. Very interesting. Yes, sir.
You said there were 200,000 Indian troops under the British rule. Who paid them?
Oh, sure, the colonial. India was incredibly lucrative to Great Britain. The export of cotton, of jute, of tea, tobacco. And they flourished. Britain sent its young men to India, the Raj, and it was an assignment that they relished. A 24-year-old graduate of a British university could come into the country and become a kind of minor warlord, minor lord, and rule like an emperor over. Years ago, I started teaching in college when I was 24. And one of my colleagues in the English department was a man named Nirmal Singh. Now, every Sikh has the name, you know what Singh means? S-I-N-G-H, means lion, right? So Nirmal Singh said, oh, Larry, why don't you consider coming to India, teaching for a couple of years? You'll love it. You'll have 12 servants waiting on you hand and foot. Well, I'm a socialist, I don't know if I would really be happy with that situation. But you can imagine how tempting it would be, right? Yes.
To the previous question, back to China, it can simply be said, and we all know this, that China rules with such despotism that you can't blow your nose without somebody knowing about it. You cannot pick yourself up and move in China. Yet people in India, be it a Muslim or a Hindu person, can certainly do things. But the answer to the question prior was the authority that the Chinese government has over every single person in its population.
Now, this is good and it's bad. It's good for the Chinese economy because once Deng, however you pronounce his name, decided to steer China into a free market economy while retaining the Communist Party structure and control. Because it was so centralized, the government could really do whatever it wanted. And if they made the right decisions, the central control enabled those decisions to be clearly effectuated. That's not India. India is chaotic. The country is just so overwhelming and bewildering and complex. And yet we have to acknowledge extraordinary progress that the nation has made since partition, really since partition. Yes, ma'am.
On the last person before asked
It's not just that. It's not just that they maybe got some material advantages by serving in the army. The British seduced 400 million people into thinking that our colonial rule is in your best interest. Don't take that lightly. Don't underestimate the power of the attraction of colonial rule. We're going to solve your problems. We're going to take care of you. We're the adults. You're the child. Maybe when you grow up, you know, we can talk about a little more freedom, but not until you grow up. You're just infants. They bought it. They bought it until, I don't know, I can't precisely get the line, but historians grapple, madam, with that magical moment when suddenly people attain a sense of their identity, where people attain a sense of rebellion against what they perceive as oppressive forces. You don't know exactly how it begins, but all you know is that it's there. And once it gains fire, no controlling it. No controlling it. So you have hundreds of thousands of Indian troops giving their lives in World War II for the Queen. I'm sorry, for the King. And happy to do so until they weren't. I'm not a historian, but what you're bringing forth is fascinating. It really is. I mean, where is that magical moment when suddenly history changes? I'm sorry? And they didn't have the leadership. A leader will inspire a revolutionary, rebellious movement. A leader will put into language and action the inchoate, innate, latent, potential feelings of the masses. But it takes a leader. Jinnah was that leader, for better or for worse. Jinnah, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, he changed history. One man. I guess it was, the culture was so, every village has its own culture. Every town has its own culture. Every town, village, hamlet has its own set of gods. How do you come up with 3 million deities? 3 million deities. You're talking about a nation of 400 million people living in very small little communities with their own self-enclosed cultural world. It takes a spark, it takes some kind of incident, it takes a genius of a leader to alter history. Yes, ma'am.
I'm very confused about Pakistan. I can't understand how the West Pakistan and East Pakistan were related in that they had the same religion.
That's it.
When they refer to Pakistan now in the news reports or the TV, where is it?
West Pakistan
West Pakistan
Yeah.
and East Pakistan
is Bangladesh. Bangladesh, but it's a big country. It looks small on the map, but it's about 160 million people. Now, the only thing that connected them was the fact that they were Muslim. And you have Sir Cyril Ratcliffe, this poor guy, an esteemed lawyer, brought into this subcontinent, given an office, given all maps, given a pen, and told to draw lines demographically separating a group of people from another. What, are you kidding me? No, that's your job. You know, go ahead, get to work. You're about a week and a half. I know it sounds bizarre, but that's what happened. Yes, ma'am.
You had mentioned the caste system, and I'm just wondering how Britain took care of that and how that finally went.
How the the tax system. I'm sorry. The caste system comes out of the Aryan influx into the Indus Valley. Before history, the Aryan tribes came from what is now perceived as Georgia, that used to be in the Soviet Union. They brought with them Sanskrit. They brought with them the Vedas, the sacred Hindu texts that go back beyond the historical origins. Their major symbol was the swastika, which was a South Asian symbol of good luck. We don't acknowledge it today because of the Nazi hijacking of the swastika. And they introduced the caste system, apparently. Now, I want you to know that the Indian Constitution in 1950 outlawed the caste system. Didn't make any difference. It was so entrenched in Indian culture. Now, by the way, did you know until the British came in and took over India, if your husband died, what happened to you? Huh? A funeral pyre. You had to commit sati. You had to literally burn yourself alive to join your husband. Oh, yeah. So the British said, you can't do that. That's just, that's not nice to women. Oh, but that's our culture. That's our traditional culture. No, no. So talk about the good things that Britain did. They saved many thousands of widows. The caste system is so entrenched that even the Indian Constitution has not been able to dislodge it. Gandhi outlawed spiritually the caste system. We are all one. Gandhi himself cleaned out toilets, which was unthinkable. That was only the job of an untouchable. And you couldn't come into contact with an untouchable. You couldn't be served food by an untouchable. You certainly couldn't marry an untouchable. It was so rigid that if you came into some accidental contact with an untouchable, you had to go through severe purifying rituals. It still exists. Still. Yes, sir.
A number of years ago, I read an economic development article on India.
Uh-huh.
And one of the points that it said was that the caste system was holding them back from ever. Can you comment?
What was the barrier? What was the...
The caste system.
Oh. Again, I'm not an expert, but when you stifle the opportunities for millions and millions of people, it has to have an adverse effect on the economy. Now, again, how India has managed to make such extraordinary progress economically over the last few years is something I would have to delve into and study. And thank you for your comment and your article, and I want to look that up. I'll look it up. Interests me. Thank you. Yeah.
I didn't catch the name of the book. that
Oh,
you
okay.
recommended.
Let me recommend this book.
What?
The book is Freedom at Midnight. And the two writers are Larry Collins and Dominique Lapierre. Now, you may be familiar with some of their other best-selling books. Is Paris Burning? About Hitler's demand that his general burn Paris to the ground, and the general refusing to do so. One of the best books on the Middle East conflict I have ever read is by Collins and Lapierre. It's called O Jerusalem. If you haven't read it and you're interested in the Middle East conflict and the creation of the State of Israel, it is an indispensable book. O Jerusalem. Collins and Lapierre. And the other book they wrote that was a bestseller was on the Spanish bullfighter, El Cordobés. Anybody follow Spanish bullfighting? I did. Again, a best-selling on the extraordinary success of El Cordobés. I think Lapierre died. I think Collins is still alive. Collins, C-O-L-L-I-N-S. Collins, yeah, I'm sorry. My pronunciation. Yes, ma'am. Ah,
And it's wonderful if people are more interested in learning more. And one of the books they suggested was The Glass Castle, and it's not to be confused with The Glass Castle about the homeless work. It's a much older book, but it's about a lot about the men in India that did get involved in the wars. It's fiction, but it's historical fiction. So it's very good.
so the podcast is The Rest is History.
I can't tell you the names of the two, but it's very good because they always have guest speakers, who
Uh-huh.
are professionals who have written books about the various aspects of the partition.
Okay, thank you. I'm so old-fashioned. I read the New York Times, hard copy. People look at me as if I'm some kind of anachronism, some kind of throwback, to the Victorian era. But that's who I am. I'm very, very... Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your patience. It's a pleasure to be with you.